Welcome everyone. Tonight is Monday, February 27th at 6 p.m. This is a meeting of the Somerville City Council's Committee on Public Health and Public Safety. Pursuant to Chapter 107 of the Acts of 2022, this meeting of the City Council will be conducted via remote participation. We'll post an audio recording, audio-video recording, transcript, and other comprehensive records of this proceeding as soon as possible after the meeting on the City of Somerville's website and local cable access government channels. Clerk, if we can please call the roll to establish quorum.
Of course. Councilor Wilson?
Present.
Councilor Davis?
Here.
And Chair Kelly?
Here.
Being all present, we have a quorum.
Fantastic. Well, thanks everybody for being here tonight. We're going to do one more procedural thing. Clerk, can we just get a roll call vote on approval of the minutes?
Yes. On the minutes, Councilor Wilson?
Yes.
Councilor Davis?
Yes.
And Chair Kelly?
Yes.
Hearing all yeses, the minutes have been accepted.
Fantastic. Well, thanks everybody. I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping at the top of the hour. We have some really fabulous presenters who are going to be speaking to us tonight on the topic of alternative emergency response. We've got folks from within our community, people in the mental health profession who are on the front lines of this work. We've got folks from outside of the city of Somerville who are leading alternative emergency response work in their communities. And overall, I'm hoping this can be a really fantastic opportunity for the committee to listen, ask questions, and engage in a discussion. So for tonight, we're going to take up several items at the same time. But just to walk everybody through, the committee members, the kind of informal structure for tonight, we're going to have a presentation from residents and folks working in the mental health field regarding alternative emergency response and what the discussion has looked like in Somerville so far. We'll then hear from COHR, the Community Outreach and Health and Recovery Department of Somerville PD. And then lastly, we'll be hearing from four different folks from four different communities who have played a critical role in establishing, implementing, or using alternative emergency responses in their communities. Tonight, there will be a lot of talking and presenting from sponsored speakers. And, so folks should get comfortable to listen for quite a while. And then I'm hoping my colleagues will save their questions for the end, just so we can get through all the presenters and the material and then have us ask questions of these folks at the end of the presentation. So this can move pretty smoothly along. If folks committee members are fine with that process that I've just laid out, I'd like to start with our first presentation. And we're going to take up items 23-0278, 22-1373, and 23-0279, that this council discuss alternative emergency response methods with local mental health providers, that the Director of Health and Human Services and the Director of Community Outreach, Health and Recovery appear before this Public Health and Public Safety Committee to discuss alternative emergency response programs, and that this council discuss alternative emergency response programs and or other non-police emergency response methods that other municipalities have pursued. I'd like to start by sponsoring three speakers. Jim Vetter, a Ward 7 resident and the Executive Director for the Social Emotional Learning Alliance for Massachusetts. Tobin Rodriguez, a Ward 3 resident and the Director of Emergency Psychiatric Services for Boston Medical Center, and Dr. Lauren Leone, a licensed mental health counselor and board certified art therapist. So I'm sponsoring these three folks, and you're more than welcome to turn your cameras on and begin the presentation, but I think I'm turning it over to Lauren.
Hi, thank you, Councilor Kelly. So yeah, three of us are going to talk. Jim is going to start, and he's going to talk about why alternative emergency response in Somerville and why now. Tobin will talk to us about current emergent behavioral health response systems in Somerville now, and then I'll talk a little bit about our vision for alternative public safety and public health in Somerville. So I'm going to pass it over to Jim.
And thanks so much, Lauren. And thank you so much, Councilor Kelly, Councilor Wilson, and others on this committee. Really appreciate having the chance to be with you here tonight. Next. And next. And next. So why alternative emergency response in Somerville? And why now? Next. I really deeply appreciate this opportunity to share with you about this topic because it's really important to me personally as well as professionally. I'm Jim Vetter, and I live right here at 3 Moore Street in Teal Square. If you've ever been in Teal Square and been to Angelina's Pizza, my house is the one right behind Angelina's. I inherited this house from my parents when they passed away, and they bought this house so that my brother, when my brother was alive, would always have a place to live here in Somerville. Next. That's my brother, John. And John was 3 years older than I. So growing up, I was always trying to catch up to John. John was an amazing student, really brilliant, as well as being really great in basketball. Tall, lanky, really nice guy. In freshman year in college, things kind of fell apart for my brother when he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And John went from being at the top of the class to really having a pretty challenging time pulling together what was ended up being a satisfying life. John would go into these manic phases where even though John was really a warm and caring person, he was tall and could be pretty intimidating. Some of you may remember John from, John used to work at the Goodwill right in Davis Square and made really great relationships there. For folks who have worked for years at the Somerville Police Department, they got to know John too, because when John would be off his lithium and go into a manic phase, John would go dashing around through Davis Square at high speed, looking really intense. And as my folks aged, I became the person in the family who was the main support for John. So I would go dashing after him. And I ended up being the person who would then, when Somerville Police would pick John up in a manic phase, when people were feeling unsafe around John, I would go meet John at the emergency room. And it was a pretty intimidating experience to be there with armed, uniformed police. And I was really glad that folks were out there making sure John got the help that he needed. But I wondered whether this kind of interaction was really the best way to get the help for John. Next. On October 3rd, 2021, at 11:20 a.m., I was sitting right where I am right now, which is right in the front window of my house, looking right out on Moore Street here in Teal Square. And I heard some really loud sounds from outside. I looked out the window right next to me here, and I saw 3 police officers restraining a black man and lowering this person to the pavement. I was just here working, and I didn't know the context. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know this person. But seeing the distress this person was exhibiting just reminded me of times with my brother. I read the stats saying that people with unmet mental health needs are 16 times more likely to be killed by the police. I had been made more aware as a white person with the killing of George Floyd. I saw this happening right outside the window here, so I didn't know what to do. I grabbed my phone, I went to the window, I did the only thing I need to do, I started recording. And I watched what unfolded over the next 24 minutes. Next. Next slide, please. And over that period of time, actually, can you go back to the one right before that? What I saw was that more and more people arrived at the scene. A fire truck from the station down the street pulled up across the end of Holland and Moore Street. 2 firefighters joined the scene. Next. Eventually, an ambulance pulled up right outside here. Over the course of these 24 minutes, that there were 5 Somerville police officers, 2 firefighters, 2 EMTs, the hook and ladder truck, the ambulance came, and finally, this man who was clearly in distress was put on a gurney, was put in the ambulance, and was taken to what I assume was help. From this experience and the experience that I had with my brother, that it got me thinking about the kind of the work that I do day to day. If we look at the next slide, consulting with communities, including Somerville, on systems for supporting the social emotional well-being and mental health of young people, supporting communities in improving the efficiency and effectiveness of their systems of support. A strong system includes tier 1 supports that promote well-being for everyone, along with effective ways to connect individuals with higher tier supports at the times when any of us may have that need for higher level social, emotional, and mental health support. Based on my experiences with my brother and then looking at what was happening right outside my window here in Moore Street, it left me with a key question. Next. Could there be a better way to provide this kind of support in Somerville? I started looking around, seeing what was happening. I started meeting with other people here in Somerville, like other panelists on this panel, and I found that I was not alone. I connected with people across Somerville and with other parts of the state and around the country, like some of the panelists will be sharing with you in just a few minutes, who were exploring and developing effective civilian alternative response models. That I found that there was lots of support widely developed around these models, and that here in Somerville, there's a lot of interest. And I found that Somerville city departments and agencies started to explore some options. Next. And I was really heartened that through this kind of this public interest and outcry for these kinds of civilian alternatives, that the Somerville City Council, all of you folks, selected alternative original response for this short list of FY 2023 budget priorities. That the FY 2023 budget include meaningful investment towards establishing non-police first responder programs for non-criminal emergencies. It seemed really clear that the need for this kind of civilian alternative response is right here in Somerville, right outside my window, and that the time for this kind of collective action is now. I appreciate the chance to share with you. And now Tobin Rodriguez is going to give you a little kind of a snapshot of some of the supports that are in place here in Somerville now.
Tobin, your mic is not working.
Thank you. Somebody unmuted me. Thank you, Councilor Kelly. Thank you, Jim. I'm a Somerville resident, have been since 2009. I live in Ward 3. I'm also a longtime employee, clinical worker with the Boston Emergency Services team. We gained the contract for Cambridge and Somerville in 2009, and I became the director of Cambridge Somerville Emergency Services in 2009, and held that role till 2015. This role is a clinical response. It does still exist in Somerville. Could I have the next slide? Right now, as of January 3rd, we have a community behavioral health clinic and emergency services program, managed at this time no longer by Boston Medical Center, but by Cambridge Health Alliance, that provides clinical response to behavioral health emergencies by calling their number. Police ambulances are often involved in these calls, and they are not staffed by community members. We long ago wondered about the possibilities of engaging peer response and recovery coach response to behavioral health, substance use emergencies. We never quite got funding or got access to training programs for people to join this clinical response and make it more of a community response. So right now, non-police response does exist in Somerville through calling the emergency services program managed by Cambridge. However, their community behavioral health clinic is located at Cambridge Hospital, not exactly a community-based location. And it is in Cambridge and not in Somerville, where the need is dire. Other forms of access in Somerville exist through the National 988 number, which is directed to Samaritans. They can screen calls directly to the Community Behavioral Health Clinic in Cambridge. And of course, as we all know, as Jim has witnessed, folks call 911 to dispatch help, or what we think is help, to people in behavioral health emergency. And most of those calls go directly to the police. I assume there's some effort to direct some of those calls to emergency services program for a clinical response, but I do not believe there's a non-police oriented response directed in Somerville at this time. Next slide, please. I think it's really important in this effort that we have here in Somerville to ask the community members what they want. I think there's a great deal of mystery around behavioral health emergency. People associate behavioral health emergency, they often associate it with police response. However, it's entirely unnecessary to always involve the police. I hope that we can gain a community process out of these conversations where we ask folks what they want and what they can imagine would be most helpful. In my 5 years of work in Somerville, creating non-police emergency response, what I envisioned was that we would have a warming center or a center located somewhere in Somerville that could be open 24/7 and where folks could access almost any kind of help, resources, clinical resources if they asked for them, social resources, housing resources, a place to stay warm, get a cup of coffee, get a sandwich. I hope that this site could be considered for a safe consumption site in Somerville. And I hope that we can use some funding from the City of Council to engage the community in a process, in a discussion process where they would be welcome to the table to help us understand what the community wants and what actually exists so that we can increase the use of what actually exists. Next slide, please. I turn the mic over to Lauren Leone.
Thanks, Tobin. So, hi, I'm Lauren Leone. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Ward 2. Thanks again to Councilors Kelly and also Councilor Wilson for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I've been learning about alternative emergency response for several years. In 2020, I wrote a letter to the former mayor and city council imploring them to look into alternative emergency response, and over 40 therapists from Somerville signed on to that. I've been talking to city councilors one-on-one, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what alternative emergency response in Somerville could look like based on different models around the country. But first, I'll let you know just a little bit about me and why I am invested in this. So I've lived in Somerville for about half of my life, first in my early 20s, then moved back in 2006 to attend grad school for art therapy and counseling. And actually, my first internship was working with students at Full Circle Next Wave. And in my, I think 16 years as a therapist now, I've worked in a range of settings. I've worked in therapeutic schools, in public schools, in community health centers, domestic violence shelter, partial hospitalization, which is a diversion or a step down from inpatient hospitalization. I currently work primarily with LGBTQIA adults in Somerville, and I've navigated crisis response in all of these settings, ranging from calling BEST, from mandated reporting, from navigating involuntary hospitalization, sitting with kids in the emergency department, visiting adult clients during hospitalization, and really seeing the ways that these processes did and didn't work for people, which prompted me to think about what people in crisis really need, and to really think about how we can better meet those needs. And part of that search led me to start volunteering with Cambridge Heart. So I've been a member of their mental health working group for about a year. I've learned a ton in that process. I've also been in conversations with folks across the state, other providers thinking about this across the state. Also nationally through Interrupting Criminalization, they have a providers practice space. And then also just with other community members in Somerville. So I want to, walk through what alternative emergency response in Somerville could look like, bringing sort of all of those discussions and that learning to this. So next slide, please. So there are so many different models of alternative response across the country, and Stephanie Guirand has done extensive research on this, and she'll be sharing later tonight about that in more detail. But essentially they can be grouped into 3 categories, which are fully embedded departments or divisions, fully autonomous organizations, and quasi-autonomous organizations. And then within those categories, there's lots of variation as well. But looking across all of the different models and different facets, there are kind of 5 important things that stood out to us. So first is seeking to minimize mandated reporting, which disproportionately and negatively impacts marginalized communities. Second, having non-police control of dispatch. So what I mean is that co-response, where a police officer and a social worker go on calls together, isn't an alternative in our eyes. There are people that will never feel safe around police, and maybe not even safe around mental health professionals, and they deserve an option for crisis support too. Third is looking at the confidentiality and security of data. So things like not checking identification or doing background checks, not collecting data in a way that could potentially be harmful to people who are seeking support. Tobin mentioned the importance of a community process, and so absolutely having community weigh in on what is needed, but also training community members who share the lived experience of people requesting support to be the ones who respond. And then finally, that responders really respect people's autonomy and self-determination. So that means no coercive, mandated, or involuntary services. Next slide, please. So in terms of how we conceptualize alternative response that serves the most marginalized people in our community, any alternative that we create starts by being rooted in anti-racism, anti-oppressive practice, and disability and transformative justice. We know that marginalized communities, including Black and Brown people, LGBTQIA people, people with disabilities, experience the impacts of policing and carceral mental health practices at much higher rates. So also there has been divestment in community-based and peer-led resources. People are often unable to access support they need until they're in crisis. So based on what we've learned, we really believe a true alternative would address not just response, but prevention and aftercare as well, and would provide a range of community-based care that looks not just at public safety, but public health. So a more expansive view of what being safe means. And that services could be fluid and uniquely tailored to the needs of people reaching out for support. Thinking beyond mental health crisis to understand the complexity and the complex nature of crisis, including family and community members, sort of the breakdown of relationships or resources, potential need for mediation, and connection to longer-term supports. So this is just a list of some things that an alternative emergency response team might include. And again, just that importance of including public health as an essential element of safety and moving beyond thinking about responding to crisis to creating communities in which fewer people will find themselves in crisis in the first place. Next slide, please. So we are so excited to hear from panelists soon about their programs and what they're learning as they design and build them. And also we want to emphasize that we can't expect to take any existing model from another city and just kind of transpose it on to Somerville. So we need an authentic and robust community process to truly determine what alternative response is needed. And it's essential that we engage people most impacted by mental health crisis as experts and partners in creation of that model. And we need to remember that community-based and accountable mental health crisis response require adequate funding and sort of the faith in a multi-year process that things can be flexible and iterative, that we can start without having the perfect thing in place and develop it. And that, you know, ultimately there's the potential for this to be very cost effective and more affordable to Somerville than high cost programs that require police, fire departments, or the most highly licensed people. But, you know, the most important thing is that alternative response is a public service that Somerville deserves. People are at their most vulnerable when they are in crisis or nearing or leaving crisis, and they deserve to feel safe and cared for. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jim and Tobin and Lauren. I really appreciate that presentation. And for folks listening in the public, we're following a non-traditional agenda today. We're going to be hearing from a lot of sponsored speakers and asking counselors to hold questions for the end. So if your counselor is not speaking, it's because they're being respectful of the presenters and holding questions for the end. So I'm going to now turn it over to Patty Contente, the Director of Community Outreach, Help, and Recovery at the Somerville Police Department, who's going to run us through a presentation. I'd like to sponsor Patty. Welcome.
Thank you, Councilor Kelly. So I just wanted to give you an overview of a program that we run in Somerville. As Councilor Kelly mentioned, it's called COHR, Community Outreach, Help, and Recovery. The program was developed, it started its development in 2010. It really developed out of a community process where at the time I was overseeing the Somerville Committee on Suicide Prevention. We were working with a lot of community partners, the COHR, VinFen, the Homeless Coalition, Cambridge Health Alliance, and we're recognizing that there were gaps in services, absolutely. And I think a lot of, you know, what the previous presenters had identified are things that we really tried to base our model around. And so we were established officially as a unit within the Somerville Police Department in 2015. We're a low bar access program, which means that someone can access us simply by calling, walking into the police department. We prioritize being responsive to individuals. We did set up a system within the Somerville Police Department. I had been a clinician at the health department. I was a clinical youth specialist and was there as a resource for families and youth around mental health information and referral and supports. And I was receiving very few referrals. It was hard to engage with community. And then we got a jail diversion grant through the Department of Mental Health in 2011. And I became aware of the types of calls for service that the police were responding to and saw an opportunity to connect with a broader population in Somerville as an intervention to address behavioral health needs from a social determinants of health process. And so we work both independently and in collaboration with officers. Initially, most of our referrals came through officers. We started with a basic mental health first aid training in 2011. The department trained the entire sworn department as well as dispatch in this 8-hour model, which is a national, international model considered best practice on informing how to engage with and collaborate individuals who are experiencing behavioral health crisis. And with that, we kind of launched into a records management system where officers would identify if they felt that the primary reason for a call for service really was related or connected to some behavioral health concerns, they would write a report on the incident, and then our staff would do cold call outreach, follow up. Our records are kept separate from the police department records. That's always been a best practice for us because we are keeping some health information, mainly, kind of provider information. And so we wanted to ensure that that was separate. It's interesting, and I'm interested in hearing more about, I've heard this before, that many alternative responses are concerned about mandated reporting. And so just for clarification, in our model, I am a mandated reporter as a social worker. However, we're not, if someone we're engaging with is sharing with us active substance use, or if they're sharing with us something that they've engaged in that might be considered criminal, we have no obligation to report that. Of course, with child abuse, domestic violence, things like that, we do have an obligation, but if it's a matter of someone is not directly targeting specific harm to someone, that is something that we will maintain confidentiality for with our clients. You can see here that our program is staffed primarily by myself. I'm a licensed clinician. We have a LADAC, licensed alcohol and drug counselor, and then we really manage our capacity for outreach through an internship program. So each year we take 3 to 4 graduate level social work or counseling interns to help us with engagement in the community. And then the other half of our program is really focused on training and best practice. We have a regional training program for specifically for police officers to increase literacy and strategy to better respond, direct, and connect individuals with appropriate care. Next slide. So these are the key elements. For community outreach, we do provide the clinical supports. We also have a jail diversion program. We've had that since 2011. The way that program works is if someone does incur criminal charges due to an incident, but there is a behavioral health element, we will reach out to the officers to say, are you open to diverting this case? And then we will work with the Somerville District Court, pre-arraignment, ideally, to have those charges held and to create a individualized treatment-focused skill-building diversion plan. So it's not a boilerplate diversion plan. We really do an assessment. We work with the individual to understand what they believe would help them, what are their goals. So again, it's based in that social determinants of health model where we're looking at educational needs, therapeutic needs, work and financial supports as well as family and other resources that might be significant to improving their quality of life and reducing their risk of recidivism. We also have long partnered with PARI, which is the Police Addiction Assisted Recovery Initiative. And so anyone can walk into the department, they can call us, and we will sit with them and assist them in getting into a detox program if that's what they choose to do. We never force anyone into detox. We really respect, autonomy and choice around that, and we really believe in respecting an individual's, kind of process in choosing what level of care and resources to access. Again, we do a lot of coordinated wellness checks. We work with many providers. So over the years, we initially, as I mentioned, we initially started with relying on police for referrals. Since that time, through our quarterly stakeholder meetings and just getting word out in the community, we do get a lot of calls directly from providers who may be concerned about one of their consumers, and they would like to discuss and brainstorm, how can we do an outreach? How can we do a wellness check? Does it rise to the level of needing a police wellness check? Are there other options? And we brainstorm those things together and make a determination. And sometimes it does involve police and sometimes it doesn't. in order to really engage with community, we have done a number of different outreach programs. In the last couple of years, we've developed an outreach program at the West Branch Somerville Library. So we have an intern who's there every week for a few hours. They bring coffee as a way to have conversations about wellness and resources and supports in the community. That's been proved to be very effective. That intern has a number of folks that they're working with. And then Kent Street is another community where we've done a lot of work. They have a community life program. And so we started by offering trainings and supports to that community and have continued to work with them to the point that this year we decided to place a intern with them 1 day a week. So that intern is available to talk to residents and to brainstorm and to to really support housing stability in that particular environment. The trainings that we do, I'm an active learner. I think that things are always evolving and changing, and so we really prioritize. I read a lot. We do a lot of literature reviews. I'm certified in a number of different programs, including Mental Health First Aid, Recovery Coach Academy, Cultural Humility that was offered through our local CHNA. I'm very passionate about trauma-informed responses and really how do we implement that? Not just train around it, but how do we work to implement that? I've done tailored programs for community service providers who are working with vulnerable populations, and that's been a great learning opportunity for us as a unit to further understand the needs in the community. Since 2017, I believe, we've had an overdose aftercare program. So we have a grant where we partner, we subcontract with Access, which is a health program for active drug users. And we go out each week, follow up on any overdoses that occur in the community. There's a harm reductionist who goes out, a police officer who's in plain clothes, and one of the core staff go out as a team, and we knock on doors, we visit locations where an overdose has occurred, and we're trying to provide information around Narcan, resources, safety, safe injection supplies, and things like that, so that people know that there is a support network, irregardless of where you're at in your decision-making process. And the most important thing is, for folks to be safe and have that opportunity to consider their life moving forward. The reason that program includes a plainclothes police officer is that was the requirement of the grant. So it was recognized that police are aware of overdoses occurring in the community, and felt that the grant was specifically for police departments. I mentioned a little bit about the quarterly stakeholder. We have like a long list of people who are active on that. We have quarterly meetings, and we usually get from anywhere from 25 to 30 individuals who attend those meetings, and those 30 to 25 individuals represent typically anywhere from 15 to 20 different agencies or service providers. So it's a great way to understand what else is happening in the community. We've really formulated that as a learning community. And so we're learning. Sometimes we'll have a presentation, we'll share new resources. Most recently, we had a presentation on the Advocates Program for Behavioral Help for Justice-Involved Individuals, which is a great resource, but not many people knew about it. So we're trying to really spread information through those meetings as well. And then our other really large program is our Crisis Intervention Team Training and Technical Assistance Center. So at this point, when we started that program, it was in 2014. We started with 6 police departments who agreed to train 10% of their sworn officers in this 40-hour model, international model that was developed out of Tennessee. Since that time, since 2014, you can see we now have 58 different police entities who are sending officers to increase their understanding of behavioral health response and partnership with behavioral health partners. Next slide, please. So this just shows you some of the partners that we're working with. We have, the public safety representatives in the city. Access is our program of Fenway Health. They're the health program for the active drug users that we mentioned with our overdose after care program. North Charles, Column Health, which is now Bayview Health, I believe, Riverside. All of these entities we partner with on a regular basis. And what that means is that we have now, over the last 2 years, we've developed a monthly collaboration meeting with Cambridge Health Alliance, VinFen, who is our community provider for Department of Mental Health clients, as well as Cambridge Police and Somerville CIT coordinators in the core office meet monthly to review high-risk individuals, try to proactively brainstorm, is there a way for service providers to reach out to this individual? Can we engage them in other services that, again, would reduce their risks? We have regular communication with the Somerville Homeless Coalition and Bay Cove's First Step Outreach Program, which primarily serves unhoused individuals. We're constantly, checking in about individuals who we know are in the community, primarily to see, are they okay? We're trying to connect with this individual. Their name just came up for housing. Could you help us connect? And so a lot of that is our ability to be, since we're within the police department, I am constantly sending out emails to officers who are in our communities on a regular basis, know the neighborhoods, know the individuals in those neighborhoods, to say, hey, have you seen Joe? If you do, can you just pass on that the coalitions said their name came up for housing? Could you get them a message? And they're like, sure. And it's been really effective, whereas for me or my staff to go out, or the Homeless Coalition has staff that go out on outreach, First Step, that's what they do. They're out there in a van 2 to 10 p.m. Monday through Friday. They typically know where people are, but there are times when, things shift and things change and we need to get in touch with someone. And so it's been a really effective partnership in that way. We, obviously have grants from the Department of Mental Health and Department of Public Health, so we are actively engaged with them. We meet with the area director. They're also part of our monthly meetings with Cambridge Health Alliance. In addition to that, Somerville has had a growing capacity of social workers, which is wonderful. Since I started, I think I was one of just a few social workers in Somerville, and now there's a whole cadre at the health department, at the schools, at housing. And so we also have a quarterly meeting, the Council on Aging social workers, Health and Human Service social workers, Housing Authority social workers, the school social workers. We try to touch base on a quarterly basis just to check in, what's going on, are there new resources that we can share with each other, are there trends that we're identifying that we need to kind of brainstorm or access more supports around. And then as Tobin mentioned, Tobin, nice to see you. Haven't seen you in a while. Tobin and I worked quite a bit together when he was involved in the emergency service provider. And as of January 3rd of this year, the state recognized, Department of Mental Health recognized that there just aren't enough access to clinical supports for people who are in distress, the whole reason that we're here tonight. And so they have a new initiative called Roadmaps to Health, and part of that is they've just established a new community behavioral health center. Cambridge Health Alliance has the grant. And yes, it was disappointing. It was initially planned to be in Somerville, but then things changed and it's at Cambridge Hospital in Cambridge. It's a very unique program. It's 7-day-a-week urgent care for psychiatric issues. And so they're open Monday through Friday. I think it's 8 to 8 p.m. and Saturday and Sunday 9 to 5. They primarily take walk-ins. You don't have to have an appointment. You can go there. It's a great added resource, filling a gap for those folks who maybe needed a med eval or need that kind of urgent assessment. They can just walk in there and get those services. It just started January 3rd, and they are already pretty busy. They serve Cambridge and Somerville primarily. They have other centers in other communities. And then as part of that partnership, we used to in Somerville have the BEST team. It was the Boston Emergency Services team, which is a clinically based, as Tobin described, team. They're now calling that, it's the same exact service, but it's called MCI, Mobile Crisis Intervention. And the new contract is with North Suffolk Community Behavioral Health. So again, we do have that access. People can call them directly. The police department here absolutely is utilizing them on calls for service, which seem to be primarily behavioral health, to see if that could be, in place of or in collaboration with. A big shift that we had been working for many years. When I say we, I talk about generally human service providers and so forth, is that the MCI services used to be limited for mass health, folks who have mass health insurance, but now it's not insurance limited. Neither is the community behavioral health. So irregardless of your insurance provider, you can access these services. And that is a huge change. We're very interested in, kind of seeing how that rolls out. We're in regular communication with them so that we can understand where are those glitches, how can we continue to build this resource with those extended hours. And it's a very unique program, and we're really excited to be able to partner with them. Next slide. And lastly, the Crisis Intervention Team Training and Technical Assistance Center, as I said, we are, constantly looking at what do police need to know. The 40-hour program covers 17 different topics. So the focus of the program is really to inform, to educate, increase literacy of officers' understanding about behavioral health. And one of the basic things is really that kind of behavioral health conditions are health conditions. And sometimes, without treatment, without appropriate supports, without access to an assessment to understand what your needs are, people may not get better. And so the officers really, it's like, well, I sent them to the hospital and they're back and things haven't changed. It's like, right. So one of our foundations of why we decided to do kind of this follow-up aftercare model was because we always put a lot of money into that emergency response. And in a crisis, I don't know, but my experience is that many people aren't in a place where they can really process information. They can't really, kind of engage. They're not wanting to talk a lot necessarily. And so it's kind of after the crisis has been resolved, how can we support you? What are those things that you need? And that's what we really emphasize in our training. We have individuals, we partner with NAMI to develop the training, and they also do 2 workshops of family perspectives and an in our own voice presentation. It's really grounded in, it's grounded in the 21st century policing formats, which again, we're still working on today, right? That building trust and legitimacy in community, policy and oversight, looking at officer training, officer safety and wellness. And in Somerville, we're fortunate that we have 85% of sworn trained in this 40-hour model. And then we're constantly being based here, although we're, we have one side of the lobby, we're on the opposite side of the lobby, kind of have our unique space. So people can come in directly. They don't have to go through the officers to access us. But with that, we're able to have conversations to follow up with officers after calls. Geez, what were your thoughts about this case, or is there a way that we can reduce the trauma and the distress? Is it indicated that they need a higher level of care always? Trying to inform those things. because it is traumatizing to go to the emergency department, absolutely. And part of that is that, you know, the training is not one and done. We recognize that this is ongoing. They will be perishable skills if they're not reinforced and utilized. And so we're doing a lot of advanced trainings and really offering the mental health first aid we started back in 2010 in the community. And our goal was kind of where we're at today, is really informing what can any layperson, friend, family member do to really support someone in, you know, recognizing warning signs and symptoms, accessing supports to the crisis, and how can you know, kind of friends, family members, colleagues really support individuals with reducing that crisis that has to rise to that level of a 911 call. And then, you know, we're now doing that with police officers as well, that same training. So, you know, I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this conversation. Thank you for your time, and I'll conclude on that point.
Thank you so much for that information, Patty. I really appreciate it. And now we're going to move on to the last set of sponsored speakers. Again, for folks listening in the public, we're going through quite a bit of presentation and material tonight, and I've asked colleagues to save their questions for the end. So thank you to the colleagues who have stuck around so far and are saving your brilliant thoughts for later on. But I'm now going to turn it over to a set of speakers. I'm going to sponsor some speakers who don't live and work here in Somerville, but who are experts and leading alternative emergency response programs in communities across the state and communities across the country. So we're going to start with Stephanie Guirand, who's a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of London, a senior researcher at the Black Response Cambridge, and the board president of Cambridge Heart. Stephanie, welcome. Feel free to introduce yourself and take it away.
Okay, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome, thanks. I just want to say that COHR, that was an amazing presentation, and Somerville should be really grateful that you guys have such a robust resource. I have slides. Great. Next slide. So my presentation is going to focus primarily on questions that you all should be asking in Somerville. The first question is, what are you building? Is it going to be an alternative to public safety or public health? What are you responding to? Next slide. And where should this program be housed? It sounds like COHR is what we're talking about in Somerville right now, but COHR seems to be a program that's within a city department, which is the police department. However, there are programs all around the country that are housed in alternative places. There are programs that are being developed as city departments, newly developed city departments. CRESS in Amherst is an example. There are divisions of departments. I think the Division of Community Care in Northampton is an example. And obviously COHR is an example of a program that's being developed. But there are also programs that are being developed outside of cities, city departments, including like I think Lauren spoke to this to some degree, that there are quasi non-governmental organizations, as well as fully autonomous organizations. In terms of the Quangos that are being developed to facilitate community responses, they include respite centers, and I just want to echo Tobin's point here. Spaces that people can go when they're in need, if it's just a place to sit, someplace to get coffee, someplace that's open 24 hours a day. Police officers have also echoed the need to have a space to bring people that's not a jail. Day and recovery learning centers are also Quangos. Mobile crisis response teams that are outside of cities and city departments, the community behavioral centers that was just mentioned. Training and certification organizations can also be Quangos. Advocacy organizations like NAMI and also warm lines are very important. For fully autonomous organizations, we can think of a larger breadth of different types of organizations. They can include mutual aid organizations, home healthcare agencies, homeless service organizations, as well as community response teams. So it's just a question of what type of program and where will it be housed. Next slide. At which point will this alternative intervene? I think I heard that CORE is primarily an aftercare service. There are also organizations, alternatives that are being developed as prevention services. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussions around immediate responses. I agree entirely with that. A lot of the alternative programs that are being developed within city departments around the country are being developed as immediate emergency response to certain types of crises. And so it's really important to ask this question about at which point will this alternative in Somerville be intervening. Next slide. And what will it be intervening in? So there are basically two categories that either fall under public health or public safety, and there are points of intersections. But in terms of crisis, there could be material need crises, mental health crises, substance use crises. In terms of violence, for example, they could be domestic violence, youth/gang violence, gun violence. So there can be organizations that do material need crisis prevention or domestic violence aftercare, well, we typically tend to see gun violence as police as responders to gun violence, first responders to gun violence, but we can think more broadly, who can be facilitating these different types of crises and violence. Next slide. I think Jim's point is really important here. At which points do different organizations facilitate different parts of the response, the responses? So we can see that if there's a call, 911 sends police officers. If someone is injured, they'll EMS services will be called. If there's a fire, then the fire department will be called. And so you can see that at any point in the response, there may be multiple organizations that are called to respond. So an alternative doesn't necessarily have to be the first responder. They may be the second or third responder at any point in this temporal intervention timeline. And so you can think, who's going to be facilitating long-term aftercare, or who's going to be facilitating the second response of crisis response immediately following some sort of crises. So these are the types of questions that Somerville should be asking itself. Like, at which point in the response will the alternative be intervening, and which point in the temporal line among all the many the responses needed for each type of call. Next slide. And who should be served? I think this is really important to go back to what I just heard about what CORE does. It sounds like CORE serves a lot of important people, and that in general, the people are incredibly happy with the police in Somerville. So that just makes it really hard for you all to see the people that you don't already serve. And I think that makes the work that you need to do all the more critical to primarily focus, and yeah, again, echoing Tobin's point on this, primarily focusing on a community process to center the needs of the people that cannot be reached by the existing services. And this tends to include undocumented community members. I'll pause here and say I'm formally undocumented, and I actually, when I first arrived to Massachusetts, I lived in Somerville as an undocumented person. There is absolutely no way my family would have had any interaction with any services in Somerville because of the fear of the police, because of how entangled these services are with the police. And so it's really important to consider that as we're developing these alternatives that are so centered around the police. It definitely means that people who are in need of services will not seek them from the existing organizations that you're building. if they're entangled with police response. But also, this isn't just the case for undocumented people, it's also the case for formerly incarcerated people, people who survive poverty in public, people who work in informal economies. This could be people who work under the table, sex workers. There are a range of people who work in informal economies. There's also people who have histories of trauma, and that trauma may be perpetuated by the police and or clinicians. And so having non-police, non-clinician responses is really important for the conversation, thinking outside of those this binary that we've created for ourselves. And also, it's really important to consider an alternative that really centers the needs of people who rely on government subsidies. For example, public housing residents experiencing domestic violence may not call the police because they may fear that they might be evicted from public housing, not knowing that there are laws that prevent them, but definitely that they wouldn't call the police because they're afraid of losing their housing. It's actually one of the major reasons why people stay in violent situations. Next slide. It's really important to consider who is facilitating an alternative response and what they're trained to do. If we're going to continue to consider the police as utility workers, then we have to think of what they're being trained to do and where they're being trained. So they're trained at the police academy, and they're being trained to handle a gun. And there's a lot more protocols and more time and care spent on handling guns than there are trainings on how to respond to someone with care. And then those two things are in conflict with one another. And so you have to think about what you're asking the police officers to do, to know when to pull out a gun when it's time to shoot someone, as well as when it's time to give someone food or give someone care. That's a hard thing for people to do. And I would argue that we shouldn't task police officers with that type of work. A lot of people are leaning towards more clinical responses as clinicians, as first responders or co-responders, and they're trained in universities, typically have master's degrees or higher. That's a really challenging feat, considering the robust expansion of, as we just heard, the Massachusetts Behavioral Health Roadmap. Somerville will be competing with Cambridge and Cambridge Health Alliance and BEST and Boston Medical Center, Mount Auburn, all the other organizations that are trying to ramp up their services to meet the demands, both at the state level and at the federal level. And so there's a shortage of social workers right now. So Somerville needs to ask this question of how it is that you're going to be contributing, Somerville community members, to be trained to increase the workforce. And so I would really encourage you all to consider community responders. And CIT International also suggests that municipalities develop community responders that can be trained locally to meet very specific needs, and you guys can identify through a community process the calls that a community responder can handle, and that there are certification programs to do basic training for community responders. For example, the peer specialist certification through Kiva. And so I just want to encourage you all to consider who will be facilitating your alternative response. Next slide. What powers and which tools will your alternatives have? For example, will your alternative responders have the power to write letters that have real weight, to allow someone to have access to emergency accommodation? Will such a letter be considered proof of residency or proof of connection to the city of Somerville? Also, will your responders be able to reclassify or amend call records and reports? For example, if they respond to a noise complaint, can they reclassify that as mental health call? To get a better sense of what it is that police officers are actually responding to now that will be shifted to the alternative program. It'll give you a better sense, a holistic data that can really solidify the community safety landscape with better data. Also, which tools are you arming alternative responders with? Information, for example, information about resources and services that exist in Somerville. Are you arming them with money so that they can support people with their immediate needs at their time of need? Are you able to support them with shelter and housing? Give immediate vouchers? Will they have food, coupons, food vouchers? It's really important to ask Somerville residents what it is they need, and then build a list of powers and tools that an alternative responder might facilitate through the data that you gather from a community process. Next slide. And there are alternatives springing up all around Massachusetts as well as throughout the country. I'm trying to create a database. But for the purposes of this conversation, CRESS, the Community Responders Equity and Safety and Services, CRESS in Amherst. Earl is here, I believe he'll be speaking. The Division of Community Care in Northampton. Lynn is developing a program called the All Lynn Emergency Response Team Alert. I can speak more to Cambridge Heart, and also the city of Cambridge is also developing a program that's really under development, early stages of development. Boston, Lowell, Brookline, Medford, Newton, lots of other cities are having similar conversations. So what can Somerville learn from the conversations that are being had all around the state? I think it's really important to consider your neighbors over here in Cambridge. We can share resources and let you know about what's happened in Cambridge so that you don't have to repeat the same mistakes. That is, trying to copy and paste somebody else's model, or trying to replicate a system that doesn't actually work, or really being fixed in what exists and not being able to envision something that can really meet the needs. Next slide. Where will the calls for this program come from, and where will they go? So if we're saying that this alternative will be a fourth option in 911, or that Somerville is going to supplement the mobile response in 988, or that you're going to have a mobile response to the non-emergency line that isn't police, or if there's going to be some other way that community members are going to be able to reach this alternative. So really thinking through and thinking holistically about where the calls will come from. Next slide. I can speak to Cambridge Heart to some degree, that there's a direct phone line that people can access. The website, people send messages through the contact form there. People text our responders and text our overall phone system. People reach out to us on social media. We get a majority of our calls through email, but we're also making drop-in times that are facilitating the spot on mutual aid space that we staff. So there are spaces that people can reach out to us. What are the ways that you're going to do outreach to community members? How will people be able to reach you, considering that it's the 21st century and young people do not make phone calls? Next slide. I want to really urge us to consider what currently exists in making sure that we have this knowledge so that we don't duplicate efforts. So there is this Massachusetts Behavioral Health Roadmap that was spoken to earlier. As part of that, there are 24-hour behavior crisis hotlines. There are 25 community behavioral health centers that are developed, and there are mobile crisis response teams that are being deployed if someone needs that. That's the state level, but on the federal level, there are 988 call centers. There are crisis centers that are being developed. They're mostly the same. So I believe that Cambridge Health Alliance is also getting the SAMHSA grant to be the 988 crisis center. And that there are emergency service programs that are facilitating the mobile crisis response. So if someone needs to be dispatched to a residence. So this is already happening on the state level and on the federal level. Next slide. So if we have the federal government creating 988 for behavioral crisis response, and we have on the state level, we have the behavioral health roadmap, we can really think of something more innovative for what can happen on the municipal level. And that's the reason why I started with this question about public safety and public health, and really thinking about the intersections. So just encouraging us to think really innovatively and envision something that can meet the needs and be tailored to the needs of Somerville. Next slide. I want to encourage us to think about other models. For example, Denver Star, which is embedded within a city department. I believe they've moved from a department to a division. And they're under public health, but they do focus on an immediate response. They do require clinicians and EMTs, so a paramedic EMT and a social worker as the responders. That's going to be a very challenging sell because we have a shortage of social workers and paramedics in the greater Boston area. But people are really drawn towards this model for, and really considering licensure as like a liability concern. But I really want to encourage us to consider there are more options than that, community responders that can be tailored as first responders to certain specific types of calls. And that they are dispatched through 911 specifically in Denver, whereas their COHRs, which is also dispatched through 911 in Eugene, they're actually dispatched through the non-emergency line in Springfield, which is a separate 501c3, and they're not housed within the city government. So just juxtaposing the different options that exist to one another. I'll keep speaking to the different models. Next slide. I meant to say about Denver actually, that Denver has a community component that should also be considered in Somerville, right? That they have, will Somerville include a community oversight board? What's the role of the community and community accountability in the development of Somerville's alternative program? Okay, yes. What kind of calls will be allocated to this alternative program in Somerville? So we've compiled a list of potential ones, and this list is the types of calls that a great majority of other alternative programs have allocated to them so far. So this includes wellness checks, welfare checks, disorderly person, noise complaints, a lot of disputes, conflict resolutions, these sorts of things. You can take a look. Next slide. Right, the CAHOOTS model, yes. So CAHOOTS is structurally housed within a quasi-non-governmental organization. They are a program of the Whitebird Clinic, which is a 501c3 that's paid through government contracts. And they're both paid through the Eugene and Springfield governments, as I said before. They are primarily focused on mobile crisis response, so they intervene during crises. So they don't facilitate prevention or aftercare directly. And their responders are also EMTs and a medic. And so that's really important to consider because they don't require licensure, high licensure like social workers as first responders. And they're also not a co-response model. They get allocated a call and they go. Next slide. There are different types of models to consider too. From what I just heard from CORE, it sounds like they're a sort of hub type model, but there are violence interrupter models that are really important and do great work that needs to be considered perhaps in Somerville too. So it's really important to think for a violence interrupter model where they're located. Are the violence interrupters housed within the police department? Are they housed within a service provider organization? Is it a community-led initiative? Do they have community trust? And who needs to be trusted? Very important question. Violence interrupter models seek out people who have histories of violence, of committing violence, potential to commit violence, proximity to different violence, and they use those community relationships to train community members to intervene when violence is taking place in their communities. This is typically a paid job. So sometimes we call those workers street workers. We have that in Cambridge. But the violence interrupter model really encourages people to step out and intervene when they see physical violence breaking out in their communities. Next slide. Yeah, so the core model seems like a hub type model, which is really interesting. The hub type model is when service providers typically come together and address certain types of needs, and it could be facilitated by the police, by a service provider, or just community, a community-led initiative. And the community-led initiatives could come from civic associations, youth centers, faith-led organizations, other NGOs, and they just bring people to the table. So someone facilitates, an organization facilitates the process of bringing people to a table, and then bring specific cases to those tables. It could be a homeless service organization that can say that this person, has done a lot of work and they are ready to get a job and they're ready to have assisted living, and who can support with each element of that process. Or it could be a faith-based organization that says that this person has had a history of mental illness and needs extra support. Can this organization follow up with this person? We're feeling really concerned for that person's well-being at this time. And so it's a hub model where people come together and pitch different cases that are addressed by the members of that hub. Next slide. So the Cambridge Heart model actually facilitates response at each point in the temporal timeline. So the idea is to prevent anything from happening. And so conflict resolution to resolve disputes, having as much community cohesion as possible, and making sure people know what's available, what's possible, having connections to community members so that they have their needs met, facilitating mutual aid, giving people the things that they need in order to resolve their crises and prevent violence. And we're working towards creating an emergency crisis response. We just got funding for our first van, so it's really exciting, so that we'll be able to do that in immediate crisis response, but also long-term aftercare, supporting people with sort of challenging things like navigating the bureaucracy of completing forms and seeing processes through, and all of that creates community cohesion. So that's, in a nutshell, the HEART model. Next slide. But I really want to encourage Somerville to think through the process of how do you develop the alternative that Somerville actually needs. So it sounds like there are lots of great resources in Cambridge and Somerville. Then you guys can come together and look at the gaps in services and gaps in care. And in order to really do that, you need a participatory community process, and it needs to be community led, and it has to absolutely remove the barriers of having police involvement, because you will not get true answers. But I want to encourage you to come up with answers to the following questions. So how will you move this process forward? I really want to encourage a community process, and that community process can involve surveys, interviews, focus groups, and perhaps you can hire organizations that are based in Somerville to work as consultants to help with this sort of outreach. And think really critically about who the stakeholders are. So all of your stakeholders, people with resources and power, but also as city councilors, but who should really be leading this initiative are people who are not served by the existing public safety and public health infrastructure. And so it should be vulnerable populations in Somerville that are leading this initiative. And who has confidence in the existing program and who does not? Those are the people you want to do outreach to, the people who do not have confidence in the existing services. And what do these vulnerable populations need from an alternative program? That's the question that you need to answer. It sounds like there are a lot of resources, but how do we get the people who aren't getting the resources what they need? How do you get an undocumented person out of domestic violence situation? The police are not asking that question, nor are they answering it. So we need to be coming up with alternative solutions to that, to the existing problems in our community. So it's really important to do an inventory of the resources that currently exist. So who's doing community outreach? The COHR program exists. the Cambridge Health Alliance has a lot of different programs that serve both Cambridge and Somerville. We need to do a holistic community process to do a full list of existing services in Somerville. And I really want to encourage you to ask what kind of data exists and who supplies the public safety data in Somerville. If like Cambridge, it's largely the police department with some data that also comes from the public health department. I really want to encourage you to think more holistically about the entire community safety landscape, the ecosystem of organizations that give people the resources they need so that they feel safe in the community. And this should include the food pantries, the shelters, the churches, all of the organizations that provide people a sense of safety, and so that you can have better data about who's actually serving the needs of specifically vulnerable populations. And you really need to think critically about an evaluation plan for this alternative. How are you defining safety? How are community members defining safety? And what kind of metrics are you setting to evaluate your ability to meet the definition of community safety that vulnerable populations have defined? Next slide. Right. So for Cambridge Heart, it was a participatory community-led process. So it was autonomous community organizations that came together and facilitated this process, asking community members about what they wanted from an alternative public safety program, asking community members what they understood about alternatives. And so that process was led by fully autonomous organizations. And it did a lot of work towards educating community members about what alternatives already exist and what's possible. And we employed lots of research methods, including obviously the community education focus groups, surveys, a lot of canvassing to get as many responses as possible. And we employed ethical methods for bringing in the voices of marginalized people without harming them. So making sure that we were actively working towards getting stories from undocumented community members without putting them in harm's way, without putting them in front of the police or immigration, being really aware of how we were approaching those populations. And we obviously centered and prioritized vulnerable populations in the process. So I really want to encourage Somerville to have a community process to determine what is actually needed to serve the most vulnerable populations in Somerville. Yeah, that is all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that presentation. We are going to continue on with our folks not from Somerville who are running alternative emergency response programs, and definitely want to appreciate everyone who made slides, and for the folks who are coming up, clerk, we can just put the agenda up on the screen. Next up, we have Andrew Dameron, who's the Director of Emergency Communications for the city and the County of Denver. Andrew, welcome.
Good evening. Can you hear me, Charlotte?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you all for inviting me to participate in this. And thank you, Stephanie, for teeing up the information on Denver so perfectly. The work that you all are doing about exploring alternative response programs is very important. And both Lauren and Stephanie said it well, that there is no one size fits all. You all have to, you understand your communities, you understand your residents, and you understand the needs that are being met and those that aren't being met. And so having conversations with other municipalities that are doing similar work will help you kind of pick and choose and identify how you build a program. So I'll speak a little bit about the STAR program in Denver, kind of how we got to where we are today. And I'll also do so from the 911 perspective, which is where my team kind of participates in the program. Back in 2016, the city of Denver stood up a co-responder program where we had clinicians riding along with Denver police officers. This allowed them to provide a more trauma-informed approach to certain calls for service. But the clinicians that were riding along with DPD identified that they were being sent to a lot of calls where they didn't need a police officer at all, and recognized that there was an opportunity to further expand some of this non-traditional, non-law enforcement response. So in partnership with members of our community, the public safety team and the community team took a trip out to Eugene, Oregon, met with the COHRs folks, learned about how they built the program, how they operated the program, and then came back and took those lessons learned and developed the support team assisted response within Denver. We pair a paramedic and a licensed clinician on the STAR van. Stephanie made a very good point that the lack of licensed clinicians in many parts of the country is a challenge. And it's something that we are working through in our own unique way. We now also employ clinicians who are working on their licensure. But the main reason why, at least in Denver, it was important for us to have licensed clinicians on the STAR van was that when we do run into a situation where someone is an imminent threat to themselves or the safety of others, we didn't want to have to call police in for a mental health hold. That was something that we wanted the clinicians on the van to be able to do themselves. It is a last resort, obviously. There's been a lot of discussion nationwide around involuntary commitment. But so that is not something that the STAR van does. But in the event that last resort is the only option available to us, we wanted the clinicians to be able to handle that themselves rather than having to introduce law enforcement, which could wind up exacerbating the situation. The pilot program began in the summer of 2020 with a single van operating in the downtown corridor. They had limited hours, only worked Monday through Friday, but it gave us an opportunity to begin identifying the need. We had our 911 call takers were trained on identifying calls that were STAR eligible. Essentially, we had identified call types or problem nature that fit into the category that many of the categories that actually Stephanie showed in one of her slides. Basically, person-centric calls, certainly welfare checks, assist calls, trespass calls, calls involving folks experiencing homelessness, substance misuse, anything where there was not a safety concern, a significant injury, or threats being made, crimes being committed, that sort of thing. STAR is in and of itself a non-emergent response mechanism. So if the call for service comes in as an emergency, then STAR is not the appropriate response. The way we managed that within Denver 911 was to try and make the call intake process as similar to our normal call intake process as possible. Folks can call for STAR either by dialing 911, by dialing the non-emergency line, which is answered by the same team in Denver as in most of the country, or by dialing a designated 10-digit STAR line that we stood up for our residents. Our call takers will triage the call the same way they would triage any other call. We did that on purpose to avoid having a separate call intake procedure that could introduce variability and mistakes. We wanted them to be able to just ascertain, first off, what's the location, where is this happening, and then what kind of help is needed. So long as there are no safety concerns, like I mentioned before, no weapons, no injuries, that sort of thing, the call takers will flag that call as being STAR eligible. Then when it ships over to the dispatcher, which in Denver, our call takers and dispatchers are separate teams. The dispatcher can then hop on the radio. Our STAR vans are using the same police radio channels as the Denver Police Department, and dispatch the STAR van. Part of the evolution of the program has been the ability to hold calls for STAR. As I'm sure you can imagine, when the pilot program began, it was designed to be a alternative to police response. As a society, we have leaned far too heavily on law enforcement for a lot of these calls that are better suited for a civilian, a peer, or some other sort of response. And we wanted to make sure that both our call taking procedure and our dispatch procedure supported that. But as I mentioned, as I'm sure you can imagine, the default was still police. So if we identified a call as STAR eligible, but the STAR van wasn't available, which was often the case, especially during the pilot when we only had one van, then we defaulted back to police. And one of the things that we set up early was a feedback mechanism with members of our community. We had several different boards comprised of community members. This kind of board evolved over time, but we were able to get some of that feedback. And one of the first things that we heard was, hey, I have a neighbor, or I personally called, requested the STAR van, and then police showed up. That made the problem worse for some reason, or was not the response that I was expecting. And had I known that that was a possibility, I might not have called, or I might have done things differently. And so what we wanted to do was be responsive to that, and have now adjusted our dispatch procedure so that calls can hold for STAR. If you have a structure fire somewhere in Somerville and the fire department can't respond for some reason, you're not going to send police. They're not going to be able to do anything about it. And so that's kind of a similar mindset that we are taking to calls, for behavioral health crisis, substance misuse, even just resource needs, right? It doesn't have to be someone experiencing a mental health crisis. It could simply be someone who needs some help and doesn't know to whom else they can turn. So we have kind of adjusted things now to where our alternative response is moving more toward less of an alternative to police and more of its own response infrastructure. Stephanie also mentioned the community component, and that's worth talking about. So in our conversations with members of our community, one of the things that came out of those conversations was a desire to take advantage of the rich tapestry of community supports that already existed in Denver. We have, as I'm sure Somerville does, in the larger Boston area, a myriad of community-led organizations that provide very specific and tailored programs for different communities. Linguistically appropriate, geographically appropriate, faith-based organizations that support various communities and have a lot of these social services available. So the desire was to create a mechanism by which STAR is who is responding in that moment of crisis or need, but then how do we set our residents up for long-term success? So we've actually just kicked off this kind of second phase of the STAR program, where we've partnered with several community organizations who have been tasked with creating that tapestry of support, so that after STAR responds to that call for service, we can then make connections with these community organizations and ensure that the individuals that we're supporting are getting the most appropriate long-term response. And that includes, I mentioned geographically relevant. We have some of these groups that operate around the city, but if we've got someone who's experiencing homelessness and they're in the northeast corner of the city, it doesn't make sense to refer them to an organization on the opposite side of town when they don't have reliable transport. So we're trying to do things to try and meet folks where they are, and set up those mechanisms to support long-term success. Finally, I'll kind of speak to some of the other programs that we are exploring, including one program that I would encourage all of you to take a look at, that was developed in Dayton, Ohio, where they're actually sending community mediators to certain calls for service. They found a lot of success with finding community members that are neighborhood specific, right? You get a call, a neighbor dispute, barking dog complaints, noise complaints, that sort of thing, where sending law enforcement may not be the most appropriate response. They are sending these community members who live in that neighborhood to go talk with the people involved and see if they can mediate a positive response. It's something that we're actually taking a look at in Denver as well, and excited to try and follow Dayton, Ohio's lead. But these are kind of some of the examples of some of the additional programs that can be very, very effective. And I'll finish by saying this, that at least from my perspective, so take it for what it is, there is a large value in ensuring that 911 is a part of this process. Stephanie made some excellent points about having community engagement, about having kind of community-led response ideas. And I will also say that when you look at the sequential intercept model, which those of you with clinical backgrounds will be familiar with, I've only recently learned about it. But SAMHSA has their sequential intercept model about keeping people from being engaged in the criminal justice system. 911 sits right at intercept 0 and intercept 1. We are in a perfect position to prevent folks from entering the criminal justice system at an early stage. And so when we are tied into alternative response systems, whether that's a program like STAR that operationally lives within 911, or programs like the ones they have in the state of Virginia that are actually dispatched by 988. The key is that providing your 911 professionals with a fourth option. That is where, again, from my very, I'll grant you 911 specific perspective, that is where we can affect the greatest amount of change. For 55 years now, 911 just celebrated its 55th anniversary. We've only had 3 options when someone calls us for help: to send a police car, a fire truck, or an ambulance. Now with programs like STAR, like the HEART program, like what you all are looking to build, we have that fourth option. And in supporting and building those fourth option responses, we can better serve our residents.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that out-of-state perspective. I took copious notes. And for the public listening at home, Denver Star had an annual report that they were lucky enough to provide us. And so that's been uploaded to the agenda. So if you want to check that out as another resource, in addition to the lots of detailed information in the presentations before us, that's attached to the agenda on Legistar. I'm going to turn over now to Earl Miller, who's the Director of Community Responders for Equity, Safety, and Service Programs, or CRESS, out of Amherst, Massachusetts. Earl, welcome.
There, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it doesn't roll off the tongue until you really get used to it. So, yep, my name is Earl. I am the Director of CRESS, which is what we call it. We are unique nationally in that we are a completely standalone department. We do not receive any policy, procedure, oversight from our police department. We work with them as a sister agency, and similar with our fire department. We will be using dispatch. This summer we'll be turning on the kind of 911 function. And similar to what my friend in Denver said, I actually think it's really important. What we heard from our community, the reason CRESS exists is largely because members of our community after the murder of George Floyd were clear that they did not feel comfortable when police showed up when they called 911. Unless there was a kind of threat of violence or a crime, often when people were talking about calling for things like noise complaints, for them, even the best police officer, and I do believe we have some of the best in Amherst, we have a very professional, competent police department, early adopters of CIT, as great as they are, I think the reality is that inviting a person with a gun into a conflict is challenging for communities to consume. It's hard for me to imagine, and I quite like the folks we have. Similarly, with our fire department, they do engage with folks with mental health challenges, and generally those are fine. What we exist for is kind of the gray. Our uniforms are gray because we kind of think in those sort of like philosophical terms. We want those to be readily apparent. We are certainly taking mental health calls, but we are also taking things like wellness checks from our senior center. If you voted in the town of Amherst in this past election cycle, at almost every election site, you would have been greeted with CRESS responders, not police, which folks asked for. We do things like we have an MOU with our schools. We provide direct services to parents whose children are struggling. We provide transportation if that comes up for folks. During a recent cold snap, we housed 9 of our homeless folks. I should probably give the Amherst context. We are a small town, about 40,000 during the school year. We have the flagship campus at UMass and Hampshire College and Amherst College. When we don't have school in session, we're about 20,000. So it's a pretty small town. And, you know, we aspire to being a pretty working class department. Right now, folks are generally just calling us through our number, but we're a small enough town that people just show up to our door. They're concerned about a neighbor or a friend, or they themselves are struggling with something. We help people with paperwork for housing, for food stamps. We do whatever we can to be helpful. I think you'll find that the kind of thing you hear often in our office is do the next right thing. So we do the next right thing. We trained with our police department on things like situational awareness, report writing. We wanted to make sure that our reports were as comprehensive and easy to understand as our police departments. We will be using the same CAD system as our fire department. That is probably boring for most folks, but the way in which our dispatch interfaces with folks and what data gets sent matters. I don't know how to tell you to do what's right for your community, except to say that that's what Amherst did. They engaged community members through very, very tough conversations. One of the advice I hear often from our folks who worked during that time is you have to learn how to be really, really humble to be a decision maker while folks are telling you hard realities. But our decision makers listened. And so, you know, our salaries come out of the town operating budget. The town made a decision. We feel really empowered by that. The town made a decision that our folks would be in the union. They're members of the SIU. They are paid on the same starting salary as our police and fire. These things really matter. And for us, the issue of our role with police is the same as it is with the fire department. We're all professionals and we bring really specific skill sets. Our core training, which we learned from the folks in Dayton, was a good idea, was motivational interviewing. The kind of industry standard for folks is about 12 hours. We did 36 hours during our training, and we have 2 monthly sessions in which they get to kind of work through the calls they've had and what that's looked like. We also have some kind of vicarious trauma supports for our folks. We made a decision not to go in the clinical direction, and I know that's a really hard thing for folks to think about. We made a decision that what we needed was community responders, and that if existing systems and existing structures could solve the problems that we were proposing to solve, they would have. There have been clinicians in our community, and we have tried mass incarceration, we've tried asylums. All those things have resulted in folks feeling really harmed. So we looked for folks who liked people. We looked for folks who had a demonstrated commitment to compassion. About half of our folks have some experience working in direct care fields with folks, and that comes in handy all the time. But we really do work well with our local clinical agencies. I came from the Department of Mental Health, so I know a few of those folks. We refer folks to them all the time. They refer folks to us all the time. And I don't know. I think we can get really too heady about this thing. Our town council made the decision for CRESS to exist in December 2021. In September of 2022, we started our operations. That's fast, but not so fast when you spend the time on the conversations and you make a mission that makes sense to folks and you set expectations that are high but achievable. I don't know. And on a personal note, I'll say this is the absolute best work I've ever done in my life. What we do looks an awful lot like old street social work. We meet people where they are. We recognize that the world is a hard place. I can't remember it being harder. That loneliness exists in people in ways that we had long thought not possible anymore. And that everybody in our community, regardless of their beliefs or the things they've done, is worthy of redemption and grace, kind of unwarranted care and compassion. I'm sorry if I get philosophical with these things, but I feel that what we are being asked to do is as dramatically different to the norm as it would have been when firefighting emerged as a profession. And I'll also remind folks, if you ever want a glimpse into what this can look like, remember that ambulances were an equity project. That's real, and the history of it is really interesting. I will not do a better job of giving you any data than the folks before me did. What I'll just say is that public safety is a feeling, and we all know what it's like, and not all of us get to experience that. And that is a really important thing for folks. One of the most important engagements we've had with folks is we've had families in our community who are going through tough times reach out just to get their kids a ride to school. And I know how humbling that is, and I know how much of a very small thing that is. But to see how meaningful that is to folks, and to see how much trust it demonstrates in the folks we work with for them to even let us drive their kid to school. I don't know. All right, I'll stop talking after this. The future is coming. There's a reality that the world around us is going to need a type of response that we are not currently doing. And I would challenge you, Somerville is a place where new ideas have been tried. It's a place where good things have been done. And why not be on the front line of this thing? Why not put a little bit of Somerville right into the roots of it? That's something I think we're doing in Amherst. And boy, I don't know if that'll ever be a data point anywhere, but it sure does matter. So I'll let the next person go.
Thank you so much, Earl. I really appreciate your wisdom on that. And as a former Amherst resident, so many thoughts and feelings to share later on. And then our last speaker who we're going to sponsor is Sean Donovan, who's the former implementation director for the Division of Community Care for the town of Northampton, Massachusetts. Welcome, Sean. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, and thank you to both counselors, Kelly and Wilson, for inviting me and inviting us from out of town. Yeah, and I was reflecting today that I have an interesting connection to Somerville besides some people on this call. And it has to do with the room inside a storage facility, which I'll explain. So as part of my years before working for the city with the Wildflower Alliance, which is a peer-led support and educational organization, I led multiple alternatives to suicide peer support group facilitator trainings at the Mystic Valley Community Room, which is actually in the back of a public storage facility off the Winter Hill neighborhood between Interstate 93 and the Armory Row. And this was also the pre-pandemic site of an alternatives to suicide support group, which people can still access online along with other groups. And what that is it's a place where people can connect through peer support and harm reduction instead of coercion or pathology to support one another. And I also facilitated one of these groups in Northampton for about a decade. And some of the stuff I'm going to share today is also resources that I hope can be useful to people, you know, in Somerville. And yeah, and so that's available. But yeah, as Charlotte said, I was the former implementation director for the Division of Community Care in Northampton until December. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about that. But I no longer work for the city, so I'm going to talk a little more philosophically too, and broadly. So grateful to the other speakers here. It's good to see Earl and Stephanie, other people that I know, and thank you, Andrew, for joining us from Denver. Yeah, so I, as part of the city this past year for the Division of Community Care, you know, I also had some experiences in the lead up to this creation of our new division within public health, excuse me, that included being a community member participating in the Northampton Policing Review Commission and also coming to speak to this commission alongside other folks in the community. I wanted to say a little bit about, you know, where the Division of Community Care came from, and hoping some of these things will be helpful in your process in Somerville. So like many people throughout the country, responding to the murder of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis, people in Northampton were also thinking critically about how responses to distress and harm and policing in general could change. And so the city decided to create, with a lot of public pressure, a 15-person commission. Some things that were really, I think, successful about this commission, it was majority non-white. There were multiple perspectives in that commission. There were, you know, 4 public hearings where people could share about their experiences around community and public safety and policing in general. And those also invited a larger scope of understanding policing, not just within the police department in Northampton, but how policing, as other people have spoken to, also is embedded in social services in the way that perhaps social workers initiate involuntary responses, but also in ways that you know, people that are seeking you know, different public supports might get intertwined in coercive procedures. And one of the things that was interesting about those conversations and the commission itself is that we got into a deeper level of what wasn't working in Northampton, not just responses that police are being sent out for calls that aggravated perhaps the distress of people or wasn't really the best fit for these responses. But because the commission did not include people from the police department, at least I felt, and a lot of people felt, there was more honesty about what could be shared. While at the same time it was a public meeting, and so people felt also sometimes a little cautious about what was shared. But the reason I'm telling you this is that I think there was a benefit to having a body to reflect on policing that didn't include the police, which already have a lot of institutional power in our city. And what came out of that was this thought that there were some critiques of how policing was being enacted in Northampton, but also some critiques of our mental health agencies. And so while some of the models like CAHOOTS, you know, work to contract with the Whitebird Clinic, a mental health agency in Springfield and Eugene, Oregon, and other groups throughout the country like Denver Star kind of worked within the city eventually. You know, we were looking to provide a different emergency response that could respond to what our community was sharing with the commission. And what we learned is that, you know, while there might be some criticisms of the city, and I think that still stands, there were also a lot of mixed feedback of trust with our mental health agencies in terms of how they've responded and also brought police in. So I think it was an interesting decision to say we want to have it housed in the city and in the public health department because of these reflections. But as Stephanie and other people have spoken to embed something in a city, you know, makes it perhaps more well-funded and well consistently funded, but can also put it within a lot of the restraints and limitations of municipal policies and liability. And so I think that's something just to consider as you're thinking about these models. But one thing that was really, I think, useful was having a commission that wasn't police-centric. So we could get to these deeper levels of you know, what could be good for our city, as there might be for yours. And so another thing I guess I wanted to share about that process, that was the process that actually birthed the name Department of Community Care. And the name comes from the idea that I think a lot of people have spoken to already, that when we're trying to think about alternatives to policing, it's really not about trying to replace policing with another group that enacts policing. I think Andrew spoke to this from Denver too, that we're really trying to think about how people that are in distress, that are in conflict, need care and response that's going to be more relevant to the situation, but they also need a bigger network and a bigger ecosystem of supports that are culturally and geographically relevant. And so that was something the commission tried to name in the very division and department. So just a couple more things about, I'm not speaking for the city at this point, just my experience within, but there was a real focus when we were developing models for the DCC within the city about who we would hire. And so I just want to underscore some of the things that Earl and Stephanie and other people have shared, that we were really cautious to embrace a clinical model for a lot of the reasons people have shared, because of the way that you know, a lot of these agencies have kind of eroded trust with the public for ways of force and coercion-based practices. But the other piece of it is that we wanted to hire responders that reflected more of the experiences of people in our community that didn't have as much power. You know, folks that might not be white, folks that might be queer, folks that might have experience of incarceration, sex work, other things that where people come into contact with law enforcement. And what and a lot of people have increasingly seen in studies is that people who can go through a program of social work or get these higher level degrees tend to be more white, tend to be more people without these experiences. And so we wanted to hire people with lived and living experiences into these roles. And so that's why we looked also to the community responder model. And I have to say, just as someone who worked for the city, but also worked for peer-led and harm reduction-based groups in the past, it's a really tough thing to try and shift the HR policies of a city, and also to, but a really powerful thing if you are able to make an impact on how you might hire, the things you look for in a hiring rubric. But what I will say, to the credit of the Department of Health and Human Services, which our program was within, is that there was a lot of pushback we were able to offer to our city hiring structure that I think will have ramifications that are great, not just for DCC, but for the whole city. So really trying to think about, as Earl spoke to, like other skills, other ways that people demonstrate the competency of caring for other people that aren't necessarily a master's degree in clinical social work. And so I think that's something to also think about in your city, like how can what you're trying to push in this particular area of the city have ramifications on the other parts of your city. So yeah, I do want to acknowledge that I did resign in December, realizing that I think a lot of what I have to offer to some of this work is better outside of a city government. But I do want to just acknowledge a couple other things about what I learned in my process as the implementation director. I did some, I was embedded on occasion in our central dispatch in Northampton, and I also had the chance to visit Portland Street Response and their central dispatch. And I could understand what a lot of people were sharing earlier, Stephanie breaking down, like, how do you figure out what calls to respond to, and Andrew trying to figure out, you know, where do we respond geographically, but also how do we connect people to relevant supports when sitting in with dispatch. I will also say that I struggle sometimes if the dispatchers that are making these decisions still have a law enforcement lens. And so I think there's a lot to be said about maybe having dispatchers, if you're going to go that model, embedded in the central dispatch that have a better perspective, and not just on mental health, but breaking down what that means. So in my perspective, and some of the conversations we started to have, we were starting to look at some of the calls that came through Northampton Central Dispatch and how they were coded. And sometimes things that are coded one way are in other ways, there's a lot more context to that situation. And so what we began to see is that a lot of the calls that were mental health, or the ones that Stephanie listed on that list, might have been, about disturbance, might have been about a possible trespassing, but they also involved a breakdown of relationships. And so I do want to echo some of what Andrew said too about moving towards having people trained through mediation. We had started a contract through our training for DCC with a group called Collaborative Resolutions Group, which trains community mediators. And it kind of felt like, regardless if someone was distressed or the root of the issue was trauma, as I think Jim spoke to earlier about his brother, the reason why people are calling dispatch or they're upset is because of relationships breaking down in that space. And so I really think looking to a community mediation, community responder model is really interesting. So I'm curious what will come out of Somerville's perspective. Yeah, I also know it's late, so I don't want to talk too much longer. I did just want to say that there's a lot of benefits to thinking more about like how you collaborate and pay and work with trusted leaders in more marginalized communities. That's something we tried to do in Northampton, or something I tried to do, in the sense that I do think as we're developing potential responses in our city municipal structures, there are going to be always limitations to those as far as who's not going to potentially trust our responses, even with our best intentions of separating them from law enforcement. And so having a really good working relationship as much as you can, and maybe even starting at that place of asking, who's already doing the work, maybe extremely under-resourced work. There are some groups in Western Mass that really focus on the needs of drug user supports, like people that are using drugs, don't have any intentions to stop using because it's working for them. They might have different needs than someone that's looking to recover from using drugs, for instance. And I know of a local grassroots group that tries to provide overdose response to people that are in institutional settings, or even living on colleges, for whom if their institutions knew they had overdosed, so like if COHR or other entities responded, they might be susceptible to losing their housing. And so I'm not sure if there's protections enough in municipal departments to allow those teams to do that. But I think it's really beneficial regardless to know how to connect with your immigrant rights groups from those communities. As Stephanie spoke to, there are groups in our area that do a lot of support for trans and queer folks, Black-led organizations, Latino-led organizations. I think it's really important to defer to those groups. There were other communities in New England I've spoken to who literally gave the money for some of their community outreach to leaders of these organizations to do their own forums among trusted leaders in those communities. And I think some of the perspectives, even in, I know it's not similar to Somerville, but even in Brattleboro, Vermont, some of their work to understand community safety deferred a lot of the perspective to Black-led organizations and people that were disabled and leading organizations. And I think they produced a lot of interesting and helpful perspectives of what public safety can mean for a greater public. Yeah, and I guess I just wanted to share that I'm someone who's been held a couple times in psychiatric institutions that practice forms of coercion and force that made the experience feel less than safe than it did threatening. And I've used these experiences to connect with other folks who've had experiences of force and coercion in other settings too, like both in my previous work and while I worked in the city. So those can include people being held in prisons, interactions with law enforcement and ICE, to social services and public housing that can feel like someone's safety and agency is being eroded to serve the needs of an institution or as in exchange for basic needs. And having talked to a lot of these people, including in the peer support groups I mentioned and as an advocate in hospitals, something I overwhelmingly hear is that often, feeling powerless or not being able to meet one's needs is at the root of a lot of the social conditions that lead people to these situations. And I mean, as people that are in distress, as people who maybe perpetuate harm, and people who are experiencing harm. And our institutional responses, as Stephanie has underscored in some ways, often make a person feel even more powerless or even more vulnerable. And so I guess I just wanted to end with one more piece. So these days I'm not working for the city government. Had a little bit of unemployment time, which I'm okay with. But I am now working for different groups that I feel are helping lead people to other ways of responding to human distress, conflict, and harm. And I wanted to speak to that in a bit. So I'd like to share about one of them and a project they support, which might be useful resources for people throughout Massachusetts, but including in Somerville. This past month, I started working with Growing a New Heart. They're both a training collective and a technical assistance group related to non-dominance-based responses to interpersonal harm and domestic violence. This group helps run and staff something called a Change for Help helpline, Call for Change helpline. Let me just say that again, Call for Change helpline, whose mission is to provide confidential and anonymous support for people who themselves might be or are fearing they might be doing harm in relationships, to get support that is based on compassionate accountability, as opposed to shaming or carceral police-based responses to address changing this behavior. This resource is also available for family members, this helpline, friends, and even recovery coaches and other support staff that might want to respond to harm that they're experiencing or overseeing in a different way. So one of the reasons the helpline is quickly becoming utilized is the way it is not intertwined with law enforcement and other responses that can make it hard for many communities with disproportionate representation in maybe not getting the support they need from law enforcement, or even feeling in trauma responses to that, to reach out for help. So you can check out a recent interview in NPR with co-founder Jack Patricia, helpline coordinator Michelle Harris, who goes into more detail about why these things matter and in turn how they might help possible victims and survivors. I'm not trying to rep my work or their work as much as to share a resource, and also just to say that this is just one example of another way, another path. So oftentimes in my work with the city, and even before that, I'm seeing that our public safety responses to distress and harm, sometimes deepen the issues rather than addressing the root problems, or for that matter, the needs of those harmed, especially in communities of color, poor communities, and for folks who are disabled, LGBTQ folks. So I share these quick thoughts stemming from the Call for Change helpline, just to suggest that even in instances where there is harm, there are other ways of doing things other than what we've maybe been taught, and maybe different than the police-centered approach. So just sharing an anecdote from my work in Northampton, I spent a lot of time at a couple drop-in centers in town, and there was a really tough incident that happened at one of the drop-in centers when people were in line for food, where somebody was stabbed. It was really hard for people to witness. The person ran away who did the stabbing. The police came. They took some notes and went out to find the assailant. But the whole center was left feeling distressed and traumatized. I wasn't there that day, but I connected with people the day after. And a lot of people said, like, no one was there to support us to work through the aftercare, the trauma of that. And none of our police response or co-responder response prevented that, which I'm not expecting them to do necessarily, but I just think I'd like to broaden our understanding of what public safety is and community care, and think about more, what do people need to prevent these things? Could there be some more creative resources even for people that might be doing harm? Not to mention people who are perhaps victimized, but how are we caring for each other in the aftermath of things that are hard to avoid? And so I'm really curious in Somerville, as a pretty diverse community, a pretty intelligent community in so many different ways, what you might gather from the people that you're able to connect with. And so I just encourage the city to not wait and try something. I think as much as Northampton is still in the process of developing the Division of Community Care, and honestly, I'm really interested to see how we can develop some more grassroots community responses that can be a little more creative than even the city departments. I think what I've discovered is that like we're never going to get enough answers to know when the right time is to start. So I'd really appreciate more cities putting in the effort to start to talk to the right people, the people who are not maybe being elected into these positions, but those of you who are highlighting some of the people in more marginalized communities that are being impacted negatively by our current responses. And so yeah, just very grateful for the people on this call, and yeah, thanks for having me here.
Thank you so much, Sean, for all of your wisdom on that. We have now reached the end of the presentations or the sponsored speakers who joined us tonight. I just want to run through their names and their titles one last time for the public. We had Jim Vetter, a Ward 7 resident, and the Executive Director of the Social Emotional Learning Alliance for Massachusetts, Tobin Rodriguez, a Ward 3 resident and the Director of Emergency Psychiatric Services for Boston Medical Center, Dr. Lauren Leone, a licensed mental health counselor and board certified art therapist, Patty Contente, the Director of the Community Outreach, Help and Recovery at the Somerville Police Department, Stephanie Guirand, a senior researcher with the Black Response and the board president of Heart Cambridge, Andrew Dameron, the Director of Emergency Communications for the City and County of Denver, Earl Miller, the Director of Community Responders for Equity, Safety, and Service Programs for the town of Amherst, and Sean Donovan, the former Implementation Director for the Division of Community Care in Northampton, Massachusetts. So thank you all for your wisdom and your knowledge and your guidance tonight. I am now going to open it up for questions from my colleagues. I know it's been a long evening, but if people have questions, colleagues, feel free to jump on and we can have some discussion. Councilor Wilson. Oh, we can't hear you, Councilor Wilson. No sound yet. Oh,
how about now?
Now we can hear you.
All right, sorry about that. Yeah, first of all, let me just tell everyone here how much I appreciate you all being here, being a part of this. I'll say personally, I'm just absolutely nerdily giddy at this entire discussion. Yeah, I know one challenge we're going to face here is around determining the will of the community. I have constituents who tell me that the police make them feel unsafe, and I have constituents who tell me that they feel safer when police are around, and I take all of them at their word, and I really struggle to reconcile those two viewpoints. So, since the goal is to capture all the calls that are going to come in, for this, whether to 911, not emergency police lines, 988 possibly, or a departmental or organizational phone number, we're definitely going to want to figure out how to handle dispatch, both the operational flow and the determinations around which type of response is appropriate for an individual emergency situation. I'm just going to jump in with some of the questions I have. First of all, I'd like to start with, for Director Contente. We heard this sort of characterized earlier, but is it fair to say that the lion's share of COHR's work is follow-up services resulting from referrals from SPD?
The lion's share is really a follow-up in general, but we really have, over the 5 years we've been in place, developed such collaborations with community providers. So we do get a lot of referrals from agencies, family referrals, walk-ins, and we are really, kind of meeting people where they're at. So, we've been privileged to help people with their citizenship, with, employment, as I said earlier. So it's really like an open door. We'll talk to anyone about any needs. We're not the expert on everything, but we'll, kind of work collaboratively with some of the other city departments as well. The Office of Housing Stability is also a big referral source.
All right, thank you for that. Are we doing through the chair? Do you want me to?
No need to through the chair.
All right. Sorry, we're all drilled in this through the chair decorum here. But
if it gets too unruly, I'll take it back. But you're good for now.
Yeah, there we go. Stephanie, I had a question for you then too. I know you mentioned it was something that we should look to figure out here locally, but could you mention some examples of the types of calls that other communities designate as being appropriate for community responders?
Sorry, I sent my slides over and I'm happy to email them over to you. And I also have an Excel document with a longer list of calls that get routed to different types of alternative programs. But yeah, okay. If you want me to run through them, I can read it to you, but I can also just email it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not sure where people are at. I don't know if everyone shares my, keen interest in diving into that one. I'm fine getting those emailed if you have those. The other question I had for you while I've got you on camera here is the community mediator approach in Dayton that Director Dameron mentioned earlier. Is that similar to what you spoke of when you talked about violence interrupters, or is that a very different thing that you're thinking of?
Separate. Those are two separate models.
Okay.
Well, we have something similar in Boston, Unity Circles, and they train community members in circle process for conflict resolution. And then also in Cambridge, and I don't know, this may exist in Somerville too, but we have circle keepers. So we have volunteer circle keepers. So if you have a dispute, they can facilitate like a community accountability process. So there are similar things that exist in the greater Boston area that Somerville could access. Yeah, but it's not the same as the violence interrupter model.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate you clearing that up. The last question I had, Chair, was for Director Dameron, if he's still with us. Since the inception of the STAR program, I'd be curious what the impact has been since it's been going on, I think, the longest out of any of these that we're talking about tonight. I'm curious about the impact both on police service call volume and the municipal police department budget in Denver.
Sure, I'd be happy to answer that one. The impact on calls for service going to DPD has been measurable, but not huge. And that's mostly because it's somewhere in the realm of 3%, if I remember correctly, but I can certainly follow up with more accurate data. The main reason for that is that it has freed DPD up to focus on other things. So it's more a measurement of calls for service that would have been held while they were responding to some of these lower acuity calls. Now they're able to address more quickly. So it's hard to really measure the workload that has been taken off of DPD as far as volume. However, I can say that the officers of DPD will be the first to tell you that both through the co-responder program and now through STAR, they have a very good understanding of the benefit that having clinicians in the field brings. Matter of fact, one year we had as many as 30% of our calls for service to which we were sending STAR were actually referrals from DPD in the field. There might be a call that didn't immediately appear to be STAR eligible. Police were dispatched. They get there and they say, you know what? We don't need to be here. Can you send the STAR van? And they were able to kind of collaborate in real time in the field. So as far as workload goes, measurable, but not huge. And then from a budget perspective, it's again hard to measure only because the pandemic was happening in the midst of all of this, and that wreaked havoc on city budgets across the country. So I can say that DPD budget was not increased during the pandemic, but that was more due to budget cuts. The funding that we have for building out STAR came from general fund dollars, but also from a city ordinance that we have in place in Denver called the Caring for Denver Foundation. It was a ballot measure that passed where 25 cents of every $100 spent in the city is set aside for mental health and substance misuse programs. So we have a couple of different funding sources that keep the STAR program going.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's hugely helpful to know. Yeah, I've monopolized enough of this. I'll turn it over to colleagues now, but I thank everyone. Again, I can't thank everyone enough for being here and being a part of this.
Thank you, Councilor.
Charlotte, I do have to drop off, but Charlotte has my contact information, and she is free to share it with everybody on this call. Any follow-up questions, I'm more than happy to assist. I would also like to extend the invitation to any council members or anyone else who wants to come out to Denver. We do a bit of a kind of a show and tell where we can kind of take you around and show you how the program works if you're interested in getting eyes on.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for spending 2+ hours with us. I recognize that it is you've donated a lot of your time for a community that you are not connected to, so I'm very appreciative of that.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for that. Councilor Davis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And geez, thank you. Wow, it's very dark. Thank you to all of the panelists. Really fantastic discussion. You know, so this is clearly above and beyond the level of depth and detail and just concentration of great information that we've heard compared to any of the other times we've discussed this issue, and so I'm incredibly grateful. It's great to hear about municipalities where you're already working towards other solutions, as we are here in Somerville. I mean, Director Contente, I'll come back to you in a minute. But it is great to hear from others. I'll throw an Amherst shout out to. I grew up in Amherst, so go Canes. And know the Northampton. No surprise that those two communities are really focused on this as well, as are the others. So really great to hear from that. And I'm struck as we listen to this that I'll sort of take this from a different direction than Councilor Wilson did. In terms of how do we go from here and make this actually happen, because this is, as was pointed out at the beginning, this was a priority that the City Council requested in the 2023 budget. It was not in that budget in any meaningful way. This is a conversation that we've had several times. We had this, and again, to be clear, nothing at this level. You all have blown it out of the water, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. So this is clearly the best and most focused conversation. I hope it will actually finally result in something meaningful, being meaningful additions to what we're already doing in a way that can can fill some of those gaps in terms of actually being actually responding and doing some of the things that our core program right now isn't able to do for a variety of reasons. But we had this conversation when I was the chair of this committee. We had this conversation when Councilor Klingon was the chair of this committee. We had similar conversations when Councilor Connolly was chair of this committee. Not exactly this conversation, but ones that could easily and probably should have led to, expanding the way that we can help our neighbors who experience mental health issues and having another alternative than just what we're able to offer right now. And Director Contente, I love hearing your presentation every time you give it, because it's truly the work that you all are doing in the core program is so incredible and important, and clearly valuable. And I appreciate some of the other panelists who noted that it's really impressive what we're already doing. And so, I think, I can't remember whether it was me or one of our colleagues during the last budget season said, one option, let's just give Director Contente a bunch of money to double or triple her team, create her own department and go from there. Patty, I don't want to put too much pressure on you there, but if anyone can handle it, I know you could. But I do also recognize and appreciate that having that type of community conversation that Stephanie that you mentioned is that presentation. I mean, it's a framework. If I could take that and look to the administration. I wish there were more members of the administration here to hear this presentation, and I hope to our legislative liaison that this message will be passed along to the mayor, to our other administrative directors, because it seems like this just the information we've heard tonight could take months or at least weeks out of the sort of initial thinking work. And I know there is some discussion and thinking happening now, and I know that the folks in Health and Human Services have been talking about how we might structure this. But again, in Amherst, as I said, they turned something around in a year and they have something on the street. It's not perfect, it's not the best possible program, but it's something. And I'm a firm believer in getting started doing something and then improving it as you go, because far too often, and we talked about our supervised consumption facility at our last meeting, we've been talking about that for years too, and we still have nothing because we can't figure out quite how to do it perfectly, or even good enough. So, my final sort of takeaway or call will be to the administration. If this presentation isn't convincing enough, and it certainly is exponentially more convincing than the presentation that we had when I was the chair of this committee and the presentation we had when Councilor Kling was chair of this committee, then what do we need to do? We clearly have an opportunity, we clearly have models, we clearly have an incredibly great start already through the core program. It doesn't, I know that, I know things are hard, but this is something that we've been talking about for long enough now that I really wish we had more concrete movement on it. And that's, it's no knock on the folks who have been working on it, but it really comes down to leadership and the direction from the mayor to make this stuff happen. And so to anyone in the public watching, to folks in the administration, we fully support this as a council, clearly. And if there was ever any question about that, then there can't be after tonight. Whatever we have to do to support making these expanding the services that we can provide to our community, because we have such an opportunity to do better by our neighbors in all the ways that were expressed by the panelists tonight. So thank you again for that. I'm going to encourage all of our, even though it was a bit lengthy, it's one of the most valuable 2.5 hours I think folks can spend. And I'm going to encourage my colleagues to watch it, as I'm sure Chair Kelly will at our when our report is read, and members of the public as well. And what I'll say is what can be done is just to to remind the mayor and the administration that this is something we want to see happen, and we really need to see movement on it. Things don't change unless we decide that we're going to make changes and improvements, I think, is a better way of putting it. I think that's really how it should be framed, because we do have a fantastic start already, but we need to build on that. So that's all I have to say. Thank you so much again. I really appreciate all the information.
Thank you, Councilor Davis. And I know there's at least one person on this call who's literally writing a dissertation on this. So that is definitely a real possibility. Now that my colleagues have gone, I'm going to give my couple of questions that I have, and then I know the administration has a comment. So first, for Sean, if you're still on the call, I'm so appreciative of your framing on this conversation. As my colleagues know, and there are quite a few strangers on this call, but I am a deep advocate for the public sector and the public good. It is a big part of the way I frame this work, the way I approach not just the issue of public safety, community safety, public health, but all issues that the city of Somerville touches. We obviously know privatization of the public sector has been a huge issue, whether it's schools or our roads, et cetera. And so obviously public health is no exception to that. But you raised so many thoughtful points around the barriers that exist within the public sector when we're implementing programs such as this, when you're attempting, and I think almost all of the panelists who are not from the city of Somerville and many from the city of Somerville talked about the real barriers that community folks have when accessing services, if the services that they've come into contact with in the past have felt unsafe. As Earl from Amherst said, feeling unsafe. So I'm interested if you could just talk specifically about some of the barriers that you experienced when starting up the implementation process. Obviously, you've now gotten to the point where the DCC exists and implementation is happening, but what were some of the barriers that brought you from, okay, this is an idea to now we're actually implementing it?
Yeah, I'll try to be concise. I know there's a lot of wisdom on this call besides me too. Yeah, I will say that, yeah, when I mentioned the conversations that came out of the Northampton Policing Review Commission, really deepening the scope of what we were trying to, develop responses to. I think various folks on this call have spoken to that in different ways. Like, we're not trying to have an alternatives to policing, but we're really trying to think about, how do we have better and more appropriate community-based responses to distress, to harm, to conflict, to meeting basic needs, where people don't have to go into the police department or through police to get these things. And so I think that's what came up when I started working for the city too, and why the original commission had asked for this to be part of the Board of Health. And so I guess one of the things that was interesting to drill down on, getting really specific into call types, one of the commissions, one of the communities asked the commission that came up repeatedly is like, why are police responding to welfare, well-being checks? And I think it's come up in various ways in a lot of different people's testimonies. But something I want to point out is that some of the stuff that we need to tackle is not just municipal based, but it's state-based policies, it's federal policies. And I'm not trying to dissuade people on the municipal level from trying something, but I think there's some ways in which, it's not just about replacing police with like community responders doing the same thing. And I think most people are aware of that. But something I think I would love us to think about in our communities is like, why are people calling for welfare checks in the first place? So just an example, when I embedded with Northampton Central Dispatch, I was able to have a look into that system that most people don't. So very grateful for that experience. Something I had asked is like, have you ever had any calls where someone called for a well-being check? Like, how do you verify the veracity of that? Or how do you say like, this is something we should respond to? And, basically sometimes well-being checks initiated by the community or by a clinician maybe aren't really needed. And so like, I think that's a really complicated conversation to understand, not just the replacing responders, but looking at the infrastructure. I think that everybody's doing of like, why are we initiating these calls in the first place? And so that I don't have clear answers for you about that, because I realize like in terms of a lot of municipal policy, even in the well-intentioned division of our community care responders from law enforcement, there was still a lot of liability the city was worried about in those types of calls. And so I guess there's a lot of people doing great work outside of municipal perspectives, which might give perspective to what you can do and what's going to be tough. I found interrupting criminalization, honestly, a great resource in the city. And I had some conversations with Shira Hassan about this very thing. And so I think it's really great for people, even if you are looking into a municipal-based structure, to look at what are people doing outside of this? And why are we being prevented from doing that? And so I guess I just want to use this opportunity also to say that right now, some of the people employed as co-responders in Northampton are currently doing well-being checks and doing other responses that our responder team might be able to respond to in different ways. And I guess I just want to make a pitch for not funding more co-response too, because that is law enforcement driven. And I can't tell you how many stories I've heard and I've witnessed that police take control of situations. And I know that there are alternatives, there are examples where police defer, but I think it's still law enforcement driven. And I really would love our cities to really invest in things that really are trying to meet communities where they're at more. And as we've heard from a lot of people, people have trauma with police. That's why we're having these conversations in the first place. And so I guess the other thing I wanted to add is that I struggle with the idea of having like responders be able to do any detainment, like involuntary commitments, because if that's on the table, I know most of the communities I'm part of don't want to have anything to do with those teams. And so I would really, I'd be curious to see if you actually got like Somerville residents that have experiences with these services into a room and you ask them, you know, what do you appreciate about what the current response is and what would you want different? And not from a police perspective, but just a general community perspective, what people would say. And so I guess I'll leave it there because I don't want to take up too much time. But I think what I'm trying to get at is like there are systems that are kind of funneling even our alternative responses into the same type of responses. And so how do we get beyond that in our municipal programs? And I don't have the answers for you, but I have some ideas of where the questions might lie. So.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate your perspective on it. And obviously this meeting could go on for hours and hours. And so we are in a constant struggle. And this is a project that I think hopefully everybody on this call has committed their lives to. So thank you for that wisdom. I have one question for Stephanie that just piggybacks off of a little bit what Sean said, just in terms of community responders and peer responders. I know that you mentioned that HEART has a model of community or peer responders. I think one thing that I'm curious about is how those folks have felt about being in these positions, being in these roles where they can care for their community members, and vice versa, how that has impacted the folks that they're responding to.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of Sean. There are the people who are in the position to take up the community responder role at HEART are community members who are already caring for their relatives, for their friends, for their neighbors. And what we've done is employ them to do this work full time and train them and give them additional resources and each other to support each other in the process. And I'm sure there are those folks in Somerville too. It's a question of identifying who they are and bringing them together and ask them what information do they want? What resources do they need in order to do their work better? And so it's a question of identifying those things. And I'll say that it's so funny, Sean, that you went to go work for IPB. They Growing a New Heart also trained the HEART responders in the IPV hotline training, and Wildflower Alliance did a series of trainings with the responders. The responders have done over 500 hours of training, and they're not done, right? And they are community members who have a lot of lived experience. They know the community members who need support. And I'll say this about this process for us internally. We've been trying to gather data about the process so that we can do it better. In the discussions, people have so much context that we didn't even know how to analyze the paradata from how they are supporting each other. So they'll know that this person didn't show up to their therapy session because their cousin had to go to the hospital with the baby last night, and they'll know all of the details. And they'll understand how to support a person longer term. And social workers and clinicians who will see someone for an hour or two won't have that context. And so they've been training us about how do we collect better data? How do we contextualize context, right? In our training, in our responses, and the resources. And we need more funding to be able to train existing community responders to be in dialogue with one another and have those resources that we've allocated to the 7 HEART responders who are employed. And we need more HEART responders also.
Thank you for that. I had that phrase, we have everything we need, kind of rolling around in my brain. We intellectually might have everything we need to respond to these calls, respond to these crises, but materially we don't quite yet. So thank you for underscoring that. And then my last question is for the group of Somerville residents, Jim and Lauren, when you presented earlier, and Tobin, who's dropped off the call so far, but feel free to communicate this question to him as well. But I'm just thinking about when you talk to your clients or when you talk to folks in the line of work that you do, Jim, and that you do, Lauren, what are their hopes or what are their wishes for alternative emergency response, with obviously respecting, folks' confidentiality and privacy, but just generally speaking, when you are as experts in your line of work talking to people, what are their hopes for alternatives?
Jim, do you want to go first? Do you want me to go?
Why don't you go and I'll follow?
Okay. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is I work with a lot of queer and trans people. And so there is a lot of fear about how they may be treated in systems that have perpetuated harm on them before. So that could be policing, but it also is within mental health. And like even concerns about being misgendered, if they're hospitalized, or like where they might be, where they might go, but also thinking about calling 988 and not knowing, it's been a really complicated process, Patty. I'm sure you have been dealing with this too, as 988 rolls out federally and the behavioral roadmap rolls out in the state, just trying to figure out who is providing what support and what their politics are and what their policies are. And one of the things that I've been talking to people about a lot is using warm lines that are peer supported versus hotlines that might geolocate and like send police if someone on the line is concerned about your safety and they see there's imminent risk. So I think my wish, and that is coming out of the wishes of what I'm hearing from people, are just having places that feel truly safe and knowing that they can get support in a way where they will not be forced to do anything they don't want to do, or where they can like truly share. I think part of the difficult thing is there are things that are really hard to talk about, like abuse, like domestic violence, like substance use, and people are concerned about getting help because there is the fear that if I really speak openly about this, what are the repercussions? And Sean mentioned some of it, just even thinking about, students losing housing, and Stephanie mentioned that, like, people losing public housing, et cetera. So just the complexity of that, and having like things that feel truly safe.
Just to build on that, with the folks that I'm talking with and working with, and the communities like Somerville Public Schools that I'm consulting with, that what folks want is to get the help they need when they need it. And that starts with getting the social and emotional supports before there's a crisis, and having a kind of wraparound of support in the community, so that all the places that feel like home for us are supportive. So that if, for folks who feel supported by the police, that they can walk into a police station and get support. For folks who don't feel comfortable, that there are places that they can walk in and get that support. So that when someone, before the level of crisis has happened, those robust supports are available and people know about them. And that then in those crisis moments, which all of us have in one way or another from time to time, whether it's a medical crisis or a mental health crisis, that we're able to get the support we need when we need it, which shouldn't mean a fire truck pulling up on the end of the street for somebody who's in mental health crisis. And I understand that those EMTs from the fire department can't leave the fire station without the truck. I understand that's a whole requirement. I know that it wasn't just, whatever, what wasn't an odd reason that they pulled out with the fire truck. They had to. But that's such a waste. And that the times when we're in crisis and vulnerable, who shows up matters. So if somebody shows up who we feel safe with, that can make a huge difference. If multiple people in multiple vehicles show up at the moment that I'm vulnerable in crisis, that can make things really difficult. And then if there's been a crisis situation, once that crisis is being resolved or the support has been provided, then having support that's follow-up support is hugely important, right? That just again, same way as with physical health crisis, that getting me to the emergency room at the times that I've needed that in my life has been very important, and then having the follow-up care, having not just that immediate moment of crisis handled, but having that, as we've been hearing from folks talking about, Patty and others talking about the importance of having that kind of ongoing support that provides that kind of health and wellness in the long term. So that's what I'm hearing people want, and that's certainly what I wanted for my brother, what I want for myself, what I want for my neighbors on either side of me.
Thank you for that. I just want to thank everybody who came in and spoke tonight, from the public, from the Somerville community. I know we've done a round of comments and questions from councilors, and I see that there's a comment from Legislative Liaison Singh. If you want to give a quick update, I know you mentioned that.
Through the chair, thank you so much. First, I just want to quickly thank all the panelists for all of your great presentations. And to Councilor Davis's point, I will make sure that I'm taking this back to the relevant departments and the larger team. I do want to quickly provide an update on the work that the Department of Racial and Social Justice has been doing with the city. So, and also reaffirm that the administration is committed to re-examining how we look at public safety in Somerville. And that's why we're collecting data, inviting community feedback, looking at best practices and other jurisdictions. And one concrete step that we're working on is the Public Safety for All Task Force. That task force that's going to have multiple members, including experts, subject matter experts, community members, and then also representation from the City Council, where they are going to provide policy recommendations to the city on different issues. And one of the issues that they're going to be working on is emergency response models, looking at the different models out there, comparing them, and giving recommendations on what model should work for the city of Somerville. So just really briefly, the Department of Racial and Social Justice sought community members, asked them to apply to be part of the task force. The deadline for the application was February 24th. And then just really briefly on the next steps, once the selection committee selects the members, the task force will start training and start providing orientation to the members sometime in March and April, and then we're going to start the work of the task force.
Thank you for that, Legislative Liaison Singh. I appreciate the update. Any other final questions or comments from my colleagues? I'll just say I was really struck by what Sean from Northampton said in terms of when they were building out their alternative emergency response, their Department of Community Care, and how the conversation in the room was very different when they did not have police present, and how the power in the institution of police, when they're in the room for these conversations, restrict the openness and freedom and safety that people will have when having these conversations. So I would encourage the administration to take that sentiment especially to heart when moving forward with the Public Safety for All task force. Councilor Wilson.
Yeah, Chair. I'll try on camera. Hopefully this works. To your point, we generally know how the police feel about this because I tell you from my conversations with them, they're supportive of this. They generally would welcome this. That's my view from the members of the police department that I've talked to in Somerville, because they spend an inordinate amount of their time dealing with these things, and full credit for going and doing the CIT training and all that. And I think that they given everything, You know, I think it's admirable that they're doing all this. But the people I talk to within SPD, they support these sorts of things just because they understand what it would mean for them in terms of being able to go do other things with their time. And so that's to your point, absolutely, we know how they feel about it. I don't think there's any real need to have the police in the room when we're having this discussion, this community discussion. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for that, Councilor Wilson. Councilor Davis, any final comments before we close out?
Not on my end, Madam Chair. Thank you again to everyone.
Again, I just want to thank all of the folks who joined us tonight. We heard such a wide spectrum of what's possible. And for me, as just one of 83,000 people who are involved in this conversation, I think the inevitable answer that I've come to tonight is that alternative emergency response is not an impossibility. It's not an improbability. It is something that other communities are already doing, and that Somerville needs to catch up. So with that, Clerk, I'd like to mark the following items as we're complete. Item 23-0278, item 22-1373, and item 23-0279. All of those items will be marked as we're complete. And with that, we have come to the end of our agenda, and Councilor Davis makes a motion to adjourn. Clerk, can we call the rolls on adjournment?
On adjournment, Councilor Wilson,
Yes.
Councilor Davis,
Yes.
and Chair Kelly.
Yes.
Hearing all yeses, we are adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.